Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's a big one. We're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Billie Eilish called Happier Than Ever. You know, when I reviewed Billie Eilish's debut album in 2019, there was a whole load of discourse that I had to wade through in order to make my points about her sound and her approach, and just how disruptive they had felt to the modern pop ecosystem. For one, while you could trace a lot of her influences, she also emerged as a fully formed star onto the scene, hitting that twisted balance between Gen Z snark, a command of horror atmosphere that to this day I'm still kind of shocked was able to chart as well as it did, with a big tip to her brother and producer Phineas, and it's also some moments of raw, confessional emotionality that gave her narratives of heartbreak and bucking against the industry a lot of real pathos. Now, that debut is not great, mostly because some of that deflective irony didn't always connect for me, and combined with some weird tonal shifts, there were rough patches there. But when combined with legit chops live when I saw her in 2019 at Reading Festival, I knew that her rise to fame would be meteoric. And it was. Perhaps even a little bit too much so. You could tell that by early 2020, the industry was convinced they had found their next absolute superstar, and they showered her with Grammys. Or you could tell even she knew it was just all too much too young, especially for a very young, very online artist who was already facing insane tabloid scrutiny for not being the traditional pop starlet. And when you pair that with modern fan culture being the way it is, it had to be overwhelming. Non-album singles like Everything I Wanted made that flagrantly clear. And I'm not gonna lie, that really had me worried about where Happier Than Ever was gonna go. Whether or not you thought the singles worked as central themes reflecting a direct response to criticism and her newfound fame, they had me really worried about where this could wind up. Not only because they could compromise a lot of her persistent relatability, but also how that subject matter that can have very limited returns in the long term. And hell, she was already touching on some of that on her debut. And while I wouldn't outright say that her promotional run was full of flops, like some people have, mostly because you can tell that her labels were testing the water and not really settling on anything, I will say outside of NDA, I wasn't sure I had heard the track that really rose to the insane high points of When the Party's Over, or Bury a Friend, or You Should See Me in a Crown. Now, granted, I had also heard that everything here worked in better context on the album, so I was really excited to finally dive in. And what do we get? Well, I have to be honest, I struggled with this album a fair bit more than I thought that I would. Not that it was a complicated or precisely difficult listen. In comparison with When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go, I would argue this is a lot more cohesive and free-flowing experience, where Billie Eilish's writing feels sharper, smarter, more mature, and Phineas's production is only picking up more refinement and texture. I mean, by all accounts, it should be a better album than her debut, an album that finally cements Billie Eilish as an A-list pop star for the foreseeable future. So why in the nine hells does it feel like something of a lateral move, or that all the ingredients are here to make this great, but it's just missing that one last bit to put it fully over the top? Don't get me wrong, it's still very good, and it makes sense that this is the album that Billie Eilish made, but there's something that's just not quite clicking as strongly as I want it to be. And when you're on your 9th or 10th listen trying to really figure it out, that does kind of get frustrating. So yeah, this review is probably going to go long. Now, a lot of folks have already pointed out, look, it doesn't have the same magnetic singles as her debut, and that is certainly true, but I also think it's more than just not seeming as immediate or approachable. The problem feels a little bit more holistic to the project as a whole, and I think it goes to some of that balance that I brought up earlier. See, as much as I thought that some of the Gen Z snark can get kind of overplayed, some of the non sequiturs that felt a little bit undercooked, it did have a really important place on the album, introducing a more playful edge that could effectively offset the nightmare sequences or some of the genuine angst that could get really raw. On this album, there's a lot less of that snark and deflective irony, or when it shows up on Lost Cause or Therefore I Am, or even the explosive moment at the end of the title track, there's a deeper undercurrent of anger where previously you could tell that she was having more fun. Now again, when we get into the themes and arc of the album, it absolutely makes sense that she's going there, in between all the isolation, the heartbreak, the depression, and her utterly hellish experience experience with fame, you could tell she might not have been in the right headspace to drive forward a lot of fun, which also manifests in the more mature inspirations that shape the sound on the album. But when you factor in with a longer runtime at just under an hour, it does a serious number on the album's pacing and any sense of momentum. This is a heavy listen, and it certainly feels like it. And from that point of view, where Billie Eilish turned in an album to her label without obvious radio singles, and where the audience really has to put in the work, yeah, if you're guessing why the rollout from Darkroom and Interscope has kind of been a scattershot mess, that's why. Kind of ironic, because this is the exact opposite direction that Lorde went in on melodrama, and they're really peers here, and she doubled down on pop to amplify her efforts to work through heartbreak, and then her label couldn't make shit with it, whereas Billie Eilish turned inward, and you can tell it was kind of a tougher journey, with the past year on lockdown likely making it even harder, especially with all of those other accolades received so early that we all remember from the Grammys in 2020, where again, she was pleading for less. And as I said, this is where I was really worried about this album. Now, performance, I wasn't worried at all, as Billie Eilish is a tremendously talented and underrated singer in terms of her breath control and presence on record. I've said this a number of times before, it's really hard to sing softly with as much balance and control as she has, especially as her influences are trending more towards classic smooth jazz, and the inflections and cadences in that style, especially in her upper register, they can be really difficult to pull off. And you know, Phineas, he's proving to be one of the best pop producers in the industry for building up the sound around her, especially this time where the instrumentation is smoother, more organic, more atmospheric. The mixes give Billie's voice a lot more space to breathe. There's more organic instrumentation to complement the percussion. Whenever there are synthetic effects like on NDA, they are more intentional to accentuate rather than cover up a lot of deficiencies. And you can tell that both of them are growing together as artists. That's a really great symbiotic relationship, although I will criticize Phineas in that rock elements on the title track, they might got the distortion, but not exactly a lot of body and groove in the low end to really back it up. It's a cute and maybe even promising pop rock moment, but he can do better. Hell, whenever we get acoustic guitars in the album, he proves it. But really, that's a minor quibble. The fact that they are able to manage to make that smoky, spare, hotel waiting room vibes of Billie Bossa Nova work at all, that's kind of impressive. Even if I've never been all that impressed in how it switches into the beat switch of My Future. And when you pair it with the jittery electronic groove of Oxytocin, which seems to be Billie trying to make her most sexually charged song to date, that builds some legit-ass creepy swell across that breathy hook, placed in sharper contrast with those gorgeous choral intros on Goldwing that then collapses into a much darker place, or how the nightmarish expanse of MDA eventually slips into the tighter, more pop-focused reality of Therefore I Am, you realize that even as the sounds will shift across styles and ideals, the sequencing is kind of really great. Now, there are moments that lag a bit or don't quite mesh for me. Halley's Comet is a pretty enough love song, but also feels a bit inessential, especially leading into the haunted spoken word of Not My Responsibility. And well, I mostly like Everybody Dies for its muted, shuddering atmosphere. Placing that right before Your Power just kills the album's momentum, and would probably be the easiest song to cut on this project. But again, as I said, where I was most concerned here, something that I mentioned whenever I covered Billie Eilish on Billboard Breakdown in the past year, it was the content. Specifically, just how much this album would feel like more of a deflecting retort to everything that she's received. And while there's a decent amount of that, there's also a lot more going on in between the lines here. Because while there's a lot of commentary on the struggles of newfound fame, overpowering media attention, the stalkers, that weird sense of isolation that comes with not being able to leave the house without paparazzi, who will then criticize or fetishize everything about her, and then factor in the internet on top of that, it's compounding the pressure of a pretty ugly breakup in the public that she's trying to contextualize, as well as her career in an exploitative music industry. Not just for the abuse that runs rampant, but also how her own newfound power will change relationships. Not letting abusers off the hook, but exploring the complexities that are now added to her own situation. And there's a lot of really great detail that comes out of some of that more mature complexity. I like how the opening track outright confronts her thoughts about all of that, and then makes some very salient points about how what might pay the bills right now in spades might not be fulfilling artistically or spiritually in the years to come. And yeah, that can read as a little bit self-absorbed for those who will never have her opportunities, but let me say it like this. As someone who's been doing the YouTube thing for over 8 years, I certainly get that sense of ennui that can materialize out of doing something like this so long. And if there's one thing that Billie Eilish just nails with her writing, it's how quickly the uncanny experiences of fame can feel normalized, half through the more intimate scope of her presentation, but also when she talks about the fake names and hotel hookups and NDAs that her visitors have to sign, or how her assistant helps her wall people out of her life like I didn't change my number, punctuated by her own bulldog snarling. It feels very conversational, especially in how it impacts relationships, because really if you look at things with a bit more perspective on everything, it can be crushingly bleak in its immensity. Hell, it's why it makes sense that she's musing on the specter of death on Everybody Dies, but even then it's not the biggest moment. That's NDA, where it feels so huge. And that contrast doesn't make for an easy situation, especially psychologically. So when Billie highlights all her opinions projected upon her are not her responsibility to manage, either from her partners or the world at large, it's as much of a defense mechanism as anything just to stay sane. A song like GOLDWING shows her highlighting just how quickly the ravenous world can destroy those who are lucky enough to not face abuse. I felt that too. And when you pair it with a breakup that was clearly necessary given her ex's own demons and behavior towards her, it kind of makes sense that the album's scope crashes back to the explicitly personal by the title track for that final send-off. But the album doesn't end there. It doesn't end on anger. Instead, we get Male Fantasy, the most tender moment on the album, where she shows just how much that world does affect her, wherein trying not to eat, she watches porn, she knows it's all a construct of unfair reality to appeal to bad systems, but she's still lonely within them, with the heartbreak still fresh on her mind as she can't convince herself to break away and hate this guy. It's not real. I don't know, there's a balanced, realistic humanity that's very Gen Z on this album, especially in its most vulnerable moments. It's not a revolutionary album in the traditional sense, but through its internal revelations, it could maybe spark change. Or even for me, it's got some of that resonance and character to it. Although, I'll say it, there's a part of me that just really is hoping she's okay longer term. And that just leaves me really conflicted about this project, because it very much is on the cusp of greatness. Hell, I can make the argument that it is a consistent improvement should you give it the time. It's a more consistent album, and with improvements in writing, performance, production, the whole thing. A project that really builds a bigger scope and for the most part delivers on it. But again, I got some questions about focus and pacing and how I'm just not sure the best moments here will measure up to her best singles from that last album. And my worst moments, I do get why some folks are calling this kind of boring, but at its best, there are layers here that are not getting the proper examination they deserve. And the fact that Billie Eilish was able to make something like this with the immense pressure she was facing to follow up her debut, that is a testament to this project's refinement. In a lot of ways, it reminds me a lot of Taylor Swift's Folklore, another overlong, atmospheric, but very low-key album shaped by dealing with trauma, where if you wanted the emotional resonance, you kind of had to put in the time to appreciate all the details and layers of emotional nuance. But while I will say Folklore had better high points, Happier Than Ever feels higher stakes than that indie folk diversion, and I think that's what kept pulling me back into her world and her story. There's a lot of unpretentious wisdom from someone who's not even 20 yet on this album, and combined with the feeling that this is once again kind of transitional, she's still discovering her sound, and once again reflects so much untapped potential and talent. Yeah, what the hell. Extremely light 8 out of 10. I'm leaning on optimism. I get the feeling the majority of folks have already heard this. If you have, and it hasn't clicked with you though, trust me, I get it, but it's worth a few more shots. Give it some time. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Not really doing the Spook House gags this time, even though that was fun to put together. I just want to feel like, again, this is a little bit more serious. I can really lean into that. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or potentially help support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, don't feel obligated. Tough times, I get it. But if you want to, options available. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.